So I can see that we are very global and in different parts of the world. My name is Salina Sanou, and I'm the head of programs for the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, calling in from Nairobi, Kenya. And as you all know, PACJA is a regional node of our GCF project dealing with CSO readiness. And I would like to take this opportunity then to welcome you all to this very important discussion this afternoon. And before I go into the logistics and the housekeeping rules, let me speak a little bit to the topic of the day, which is about Indigenous peoples, gender, and REDD+ within GCF, and how important these areas are quite strategic for our discussion. Indigenous people and women, I want to look at them together instead of, because they go through similar difficulties in our communities. So Indigenous people and women are among the most vulnerable people worldwide, and therefore they need technical and financial support from global finance instruments. The irony is that there are many stringent procedures required for accessibility of finances, considering that Indigenous people and women have low technical capacity in developing bankable proposals as required by most of these financial institutions. If I take the case of Africa, for instance, which I'm very much familiar, land tenure is a common factor of production. And yet women and Indigenous people occasionally have no control, no decision-making on land use for the sustainability of their livelihoods. Women and Indigenous people must remain key priority when it comes to allocation of resources. If I give you another example, again from Africa, if you look at pastoral women in Burkina Faso, Kenya, Ethiopia, Tanzania, they do not own any parcel of land, yet the responsibility of taking care of the family amid a climate crisis lies solely on their shoulders. And if you look at an Indigenous community like the Okiek in Kenya, they are Indigenous, they are marginalized, and they are a minority. And and yet, you know, they do not, there's another key example of this critical role of Indigenous community in resource management and climate adaptation. And therefore, we need to make Indigenous people and women a priority when it comes into discussions around the Green Climate Fund. REDD+ remains a very important avenue for supporting sustainable management of forests in Africa and worldwide. However, the carbon market must also respond to this need of management of forests. At the moment, the prices of tons of carbon equivalent is not a good enough incentive for management of our carbon stocks. African countries, for instance, need support for development of credible REDD+ strategies, but most importantly, the implementation of these strategies. So these strategies may be there, but sitting in our shelves and collecting dust. Implementation of such strategies is a capital-intensive venture, and without financial assistance, most of the countries may not be able to implement such strategies. Capacity building, therefore,
Salina,
societies.
Salina,
Women and Indigenous people remains a key. Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yes.
Two things. We're not seeing your screen, and second, please try to speak a little bit slower so the interpreters can follow.
Okay. These were just opening remarks for my part, so I wasn't sharing those remarks because I'm going to be sharing the PowerPoint. So okay. I just wanted to set the stage, give a little bit of background on Indigenous people and women, and also REDD+ and why they are important within the GCF, within GCF. So and I've just spoken to them. So I'm just saying that capacity building and of security, since the success of any given REDD+ strategy is dependent on support of the forests and of the local communities. So I was just setting the stage by looking into that. So now let me go back to the PowerPoint and do the presentation on that. And these are really logistics and house rules. So for your information, as funding recipients to document the participants, your data will now be recorded for the purpose of documentation for the funder via screenshot of the list of participants. Please name yourself as precisely as possible for this purpose with first name, your surname, your institution, or with anonymous if you do not agree to this. Now, next thing, I'm going to invite the interpreters, first in Spanish to take you through the interpretation mechanisms, and then in French. So can I invite the two of them now, please?
Gracias. Good morning, buenos días. My name is Maria Angelica. My pronouns are she and they. And today, our colleagues and I will be providing French, Spanish, and English interpretation to ensure that we all not only have access to the space, but that we can also express ourselves in the language that we choose between Spanish, French, and English. This will be a multilingual space, so we ask you that you please choose an interpretation channel in order to be able to listen to everyone in the space today. So if you would like to listen to the interpretation and you are joining us from your computer, as you can see on the screen, at the bottom right corner, you're going to see a globe that says interpretation. When you click on it, you can choose the language in which you want to listen and participate, and then you click done. If you are joining us from your phone, on your Zoom phone screen, you're going to see 3 dots on the screen that say more. When you touch the dots, you choose language interpretation, then you choose the language that you prefer, and then you touch done at the top right corner. We are going to put these instructions in the chat, and if anyone has any issues with interpretation, please let us know in the chat and we'll be happy to support you. Thank you. Buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches. Mi nombre es María Angélica, mis pronombres son ella, ellix, y hoy nuestras colegas y yo vamos a proveer interpretación en español, francés e inglés para asegurarnos de que tengamos acceso a este espacio y también nos podamos expresar en el idioma que deseemos entre el español, el francés y el inglés. Entonces, para escuchar la interpretación hoy, este va a ser un espacio multilingüe y es importante que por favor elijan uno de los canales de interpretación. Si nos están acompañando desde su computador, como pueden ver en la pantalla, abajo en su pantalla mano derecha hay un globo que dice interpretación. Cuando le hacen clic pueden escoger el idioma en el que deseen escuchar y participar. Y eso es todo. Si nos están acompañando desde su teléfono, en la pantalla de Zoom de su teléfono, abajo a mano derecha, hay 3 puntos que dicen más. Cuando tocan los puntos, eligen interpretación de idiomas y después eligen el idioma que desean. Y al final tocan en la parte de arriba a la derecha, done o finalización. Si necesitan las instrucciones nuevamente las vamos a poner en el chat a lo largo del programa y si tienen algún problema con su interpretación o alguna pregunta, déjenoslo saber en el chat y con mucho gusto les ayudaremos. Ahora I will pass the mic on to our colleague, French colleague interpreters. Thank you.
Hello, anybody to do it in French or is... Berta, was anybody doing this in French?
Oui, bonjour.
Yes.
Alors, si vous suivez ce webinaire depuis un téléphone portable, donc vous pouvez cliquer sur les 3 petits points de votre écran et sélectionner l'interprétation en français, en espagnol ou en anglais. Si vous nous suivez depuis un ordinateur, vous verrez le petit globe en bas à droite et vous pourrez sélectionner la langue en cliquant sur « Terminer » une fois que vous avez sélectionné la langue. Voilà, merci.
Merci bien, ça c'était très good to the point. Therefore, you've had this you've been explained in this in all the 3 languages. I guess there's no Portuguese, so it takes everyone's commitment to create a multilingual virtual convening. We ask for everyone's support with the following instructions. Now, going to the next place, you can see the instructions now you're being given here. Speak at a slower pace, speak loud and clear, 1 person at a time. Say your name each time you participate. Announce the language you will be participating in. Take a pause after a phrase when speaker switches after asking a question, and then mute your mic. Please, those are the instructions, and please follow them. 1 person at a time. Mute your mic when you are not speaking. Speak clearly. Don't speak too fast like me. It's very difficult for me actually to go slow, but I will try my very best. Okay. So effective civil society monitoring of Green Climate Fund is crucial to avoid damages and make the best use of much needed climate resources. GCF Watch is a civil society initiative led from the Global South, created to improve access to information on GCF matters and enable better public follow-up and supervision of the GCF. So in this international series of 3 webinars, experts from across the globe will discuss engaging through this GCF Watch platform. Updated information on the GCF, its board meetings, and the main issues of 2021 will be discussed, as well as ways in which people and communities can engage with the fund in their countries and regions. Each session will include expert presentations followed by an open space for conversation among attendees and panelists. Now, so these are we've organized a series of 3 webinars. We had one in June, session 1, which was on GCF Watch platforms and an overview of 2021. That one was already done. Now, today we are on the second one, 8th of July, which is on gender, REDD+, and indigenous peoples within GCF. And then we'll have one more on July 29, which is session 3, engaging with the GCF in different regions and countries. Those are our 3 webinars for this period. Now, so the main takeaways, look at the agenda for the second webinar. The main takeaways from the board 29, Liane Schalatek, I hope I'm pronouncing that well, Heinrich Böll Stiftung, Gender and the GCF, Tara Daniel, Women's Environment and Development, WEDO, Indigenous Peoples and at the GCF, Helen Magata, Tebtebba, REDD+ at the GCF, you have Souparna, Lahiri, Global Forest Coalition, and on open discussions. And I am the moderator for today, Salina, Sanou from PACJA. So let me now very quickly introduce the great speakers for this evening, this afternoon, or this morning for this discussion. I'll start with my friend Liane Schalatek. We together organized a meeting during the People Summit in New York, and it was a very interesting session. So Liane is the Associate Director of the Heinrich Böll Stiftung in Washington, D.C. She has more than 20 years of experience in global governance issues, specifically in international development and finance and international climate negotiations, as well as the promotion of human rights, gender equality, and women's empowerment. And as an expert on gender and climate finance, she works on the gender dimension of climate financing instruments and operations, including in the GCF, other climate funds, and the UNFCCC more broadly. So that is Liane. Now our next speaker, our next prominent speaker is Tara Daniel. She's a program manager of WEDO. Tara leads WEDO's portfolio of work on feminist climate finance, supports women participation and leadership in the climate negotiations, and advocates for gender-responsive climate policies, particularly working with the women and gender constituency. Tara draws from her interdisciplinary background, including dual master's degree in sustainable development and conservation biology and public policy from the University of Maryland, for her feminist analysis and advocacy. The next prominent speaker we have today is Helen. Bianclen Magata and Helen, sorry, I hope I'm pronouncing your name very well. Helen is an indigenous colored clan from Paracelis Mountain Province in the Philippines. She is communication officer at Tebtebba, Foundation of Indigenous Peoples, International Center for Policy, Research and Education. She has dedicated her last 15 years in working the field of research, education, and communication, specifically on Indigenous people's rights, climate change, and community development. Helen is part of the Indigenous Peoples Advocacy Team on the Green Climate Fund. Last but not least, we have our last great speaker today is Souparna Lahiri. Souparna is the climate policy forest coalition based in this. He's worked with the. I'm getting an issue with my phone. India. He has worked with the forest communities in India for 20 years on issues of rights over forest resources and community forest governance. A founder member of Durban Group on Climate Justice, he follows Article 6 negotiations in UNFCCC, offsets, NBS, and the Zero Debates and the Climate and Biodiversity Interface in CBD. So those are our 4 speakers for this afternoon. And without much ado, let me go now back and start with Liane to do her presentation. Welcome, Liane.
Thank you so much, Salina, for the great introduction. Salina, if you stop your screen sharing so that I can share my screen for the presentation. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Let me do that now, if I know how to do it. Okay.
If not, I can also do that. Obviously,
I may need help there. Copying this.
Yeah.
I'm trying. And how do you? I can. Okay. I can. How do you stop sharing there? Did I do that? Did I manage? No.
No, unfortunately, your screen is still up. But I can probably, in interest of time, then just speak without the presentation.
Here we are.
Okay, perfect.
There
Great.
We are. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
So hopefully that means I should be able to now share my screen share. Hope that people can see it. If I can get a yes or a thumbs up from people, yes, that they can see it. Perfect. Then let's get started. Thanks again, Salina, for the great introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to present here today, this morning, this afternoon, this evening. Good morning, afternoon, evening to you all. I was asked to give a short recap of what has happened in the 29th GCF board meeting that was convened last week over a 4-day framework. I probably will not be able to go in depth into all of that, but I'm trying to cover as much as possible, maybe just as an overview. And I apologize that unfortunately the PowerPoint is only in English, but hopefully with the interpretation you are still able to follow along. We had a very ambitious agenda, but only a few agenda items were actually tackled. Some of that involved the discourse about the financial status of the GCF, how much money it has and how much it can commit to funding proposals. We had some very serious and contentious and very long-lasting discourses about the role of an advisory panel called the Independent Technical Advisory Panel, which is to review funding proposal and acts as a gatekeeper of which one reached the board and which one cannot reach the board for consideration. We had 4 project program proposals adopted, worth together $501 US. We had 10 accreditation applicants approved. Among them was one international bank, SMBC, a Japanese bank, that whose accreditation was heavily opposed by civil society on account of their fossil fuel financing accord. We had the adoption of something called the Integrated Results Management Framework, which has been a long-standing issue and which led to very long and very diverse procedural wrestling among board members, including on whether they actually could be voting for the first time on a policy. So far, voting in the board when consensus has been missing has only been applied to funding decisions. And then we had several crucial discussions and decisions which were postponed, including the update to the accreditation framework, discussions on incremental and full cost methodology, policy on concessionality, and the GCF support to adaptation. All of those have very strong implications for how well gender integration is going to happen for the rights of Indigenous peoples. And with that, the core topic of the discussion today. I just want to spend half a second on the discourse about the commitment authority. There is a lot of detail here. The important part is that because the contributors to the first replenishment of the GCF commit their money over time, not all of them have paid up front, but over time and at different schedules. The money that the GCF has available at each board meeting actually fluctuates quite significantly. And for the next couple of board meetings, if things continue as they are, it would be relatively low, which means you could only approve a relatively low amount for fundings. This, of course, would be a problem because at the moment the GCF is hoping to fund proposals worth close to $1 billion at each board meeting. And this is necessary to stay on track for replenishment, which actually with the current funding period ending at the end of 2023 means that already in the midst of next year, we are starting the discourse about replenishment. We had then a discourse about the role of the Independent Technical Assessment Panel and their way of actually stopping proposals that the Secretariat felt has been ready from coming to the board. For last week's board meeting, we had actually 3 proposals where the Secretariat gave the go-ahead for consideration of the board, but the ITAP actually said they were not ready, and those were 2 adaptation projects and 1 cross-cutting project. And so within the board, we had a long discourse about whether the ITAP, the Independent Technical Advisory Panel, actually should really act as a gatekeeper, should have that role. It's important to note that that role was given to the board initially, but a lot of board members, particularly from developing countries, are very worried how the ITAP assesses proposals, particularly adaptation proposals. And one issue that has come up there is the issue of so-called climate rationale, which is actually the justification that a project is a climate project and not a development project. And that has caused in the past quite a bit of problems and will continue to cause problems as long as the GCF has not cleared its adaptation approach with respect to funding proposals. So we had then quite a bit of wrangling about that. There were concerns that in adaptation specifically, there is too much focus on too much reliance on certificate data, which might be particularly difficult for some on-the-ground community-based funding proposals that we are looking at or that we want to see supported, and which are to provide some direct benefits to communities, including women on the ground, and where very often, again, the scientific cases might be hard to establish. We had then 4 funding proposals approved. I'm just going to go really quickly through them. One was a funding proposal in the Maldives by the Japan International Cooperation Agency. This was actually trying to shore up beach areas, some of the civil society concerns that we had there, and again, it was an approved project, was particularly related to the dredging of sand and the question of whether local communities had been informed, were part of the decision making, how they are involved in upkeep, and whether their livelihood securities in this project has been considered. Another funding proposal approved was the light rail transit for the greater metropolitan area in Costa Rica. That was by a regional development bank called CABAI. Some of the concerns that civil society had at that project, which we overall supported, was some of the issue of participation, of stakeholder participation, both in the development, but also going forward in terms of monitoring whether the benefits of that project, meaning public transportation, is accessible, including gender responsive access to it. The next proposal that was approved was a funding proposal in Eastern Rwanda, an adaptation project. There we had some concerns brought forward that some indigenous groups felt that they weren't heard in the design of the project. They have some concern that they might not benefiting from the project, and overall, as it involves changing livelihoods, including for pastoralist communities, the issue there is whether that is introduced as a top-down approach or whether it's actually done and implemented participatory according to the needs and the wishes of the community for which it's supposed to serve. And then I guess I forgot the last one, and I apologize for that. The last one, the proposal was actually a funding proposal by the African Development Bank related to renewable energy, to solar energy, distributed solar energy in a number of African countries. Some of the concerns that we had with that proposal particularly was worrying about whether with its focus on actually providing financial risk management to local financial institutions, that the affordability of those distributed renewable energy panels might actually not be shared, or it might not be affordable to some of the recipients of that energy. Again, those proposals were all approved. We had then accreditation decisions. So after B29, we have now 113 accredited entities, most of which are direct access entities, including through 9 that were approved at the last board meeting, and you see them listed here. I'm not going through them, but the important part to remember is that being accredited to the Green Climate Fund does not yet mean you are able to actually implement funding. And unfortunately, right now, with the approved 100, I think now 80 projects that we have, only about 14% of funding approved is actually channeled through direct access entity, where the large majority is going through international access entities. I just want to point out really quickly the 3 bolded entities that were accredited. As I mentioned already, Sumitomo Mitsui Banking Corporation from Japan was the only multilateral entity, international access entity that was accredited. This has been repeatedly delayed, among others, because of a pushback by civil society. We had a civil society sign on letters with more than 450 signatories opposing it. Main concern there as a major fossil fuel funder that their proposed new coal policy is not going far enough. Likewise, with NAFIN, the Mexican direct access entity that was approved, we are concerned about its fossil fuel portfolio, funding portfolio, and with the Korea International Cooperation Agency, KOICA, from South Korea, which is a bilateral development agency. We are concerned that it was approved as a direct access entity when it is funding and supporting funding internationally. And so this is not in line with the direct access entity. Big issue, as mentioned, was the adoption of the integrated results management framework. This has been a long-standing item. It's supposed to replace existing results management and performance measurement frameworks for mitigation and adaptation. Coming into the board meeting, there were several contentious issues unsolved. A small group of board members had tried to resolve that, and they related to how to measure the paradigm shift of proposals. This is this goal that you really contribute over the one approved project further to shifting the policies and the framework within the host country, the role of sustainable development, how much assistance there should be for direct access entities so that they are able to engage with that project, with that framework. And then the board's role, because a number of board members wanted to see what implementation guidance the Secretariat is going to give to accredited entity, just not trusting that they, for example, give it in accordance with some of the board's priorities. What we had done was an effort to try to apply voting and a determination that no consensus was possible on this, and this led to a really long, basically a 2.5-day stalemate on whether actually there needs to be a vote on whether you are allowed to vote. Too much to really go in there, but just want to point out that ultimately a consensus was found after a vote was taken on whether the consensus was exhausted, and that raises a lot of larger procedural questions. I just want to quickly, in the 1 minute that I have, point out some of the outstanding items, just zoning in on the matters related here to the investment framework, the incremental and full cost methodology, the policy on concessionality, and the GCF support to adaptation. Those are really crucial for gender responsive, community-based, benefit shared implementation of projects and approval of funding projects in the Green Climate Fund. The incremental and the full cost methodology comes particularly to bear in adaptation projects, where you very often have the claim that something is not really adaptation, but is development related, and so cannot be funded at full cost. Likewise, the policy on concessionality is trying to actually, in a way, limit the availability and the appropriateness of using grant financing in favor of other financial instruments. And the GCF support to adaptation discourse likewise is one where we have the pending issues about, again, what issue is adaptation, what is development, is it even useful to make a differentiation for projects implemented on the ground in communities. There are some technical, we had some technical sessions in the Green Climate Funds with the technical expert workshop that pointed out that that differentiation is not useful. However, those policies in going forward would probably enshrine such a differentiation with all the implementation for costs. Lastly, because of the fact that we had so many issues, quote unquote, unopened, we are seeing a lot more decisions being taken, not in the board, meaning not in the public sphere. The board meetings are webcast, but as decision in between meetings, where civil society has much less possibility to try to make their concerns on issues known to board members. And so this is a serious concern going forward, that to the extent that a board meeting like our last board meeting at the GCF is very ineffective in getting decisions approved, that a lot of that will switch in between meetings. And I'll stop there. Thanks so much. Now I just have to figure out how to stop screen sharing.
Okay, there will be, okay, you've already started. Thank you so much, Liane. That was a very comprehensive, very articulate presentation. And I'm sure people are listening very attentively. I forgot to remind people that whatever questions or comments you have, please put them on the chat, and our colleague Florencia will support me in sorting those out. Let me also remind our presenters that you have 10 minutes or so at least to get the presentation through, so that you can also give your participants enough time to ask you questions and to make comments. Thank you very much. Let me now invite our second speaker, who is Tara Daniel from WEDO. Tara, welcome.
Thank you very much. I am very glad to be here to give just a glimpse into gender in the GCF and to be alongside panelists who are some of my favorite colleagues to work with in the GCF Observer Network of civil society, Indigenous peoples, and local communities. So I do have a colleague that will be placing links to the translated slides in the chat, in addition to the interpretation that's being provided. But in the next few minutes, I want to touch upon some key documents and materials that you could use to help further understand how gender is being captured within the GCF. But I really want to make sure that after we review those materials, that we recognize at a much broader level that advancing gender responsive climate action within the Green Climate Fund is beyond the gender policy. It's beyond the gender action plan within an individual project. It really speaks to the entire suite of policy issues and approaches that we see in the GCF, which is why I'm so glad to be following Liana's presentation on some of those key issues that continue to be discussed and that will shape the future of how gender responsive the GCF is able to be, to really ultimately deliver on the promise that it had embedded from the beginning. This was the first climate fund to recognize the importance of gender in its founding documents. And here is an excerpt from one of those mentions, a key mention in paragraph 3 of the governing instrument, looking at maximizing the impact of the funding and connecting that to taking a gender sensitive approach. So this is one place GCF's commitment to gender. However, we did not get our first gender policy in the GCF until 2015, and then that was updated in 2019. And one reason that I wanted to show this screenshot here, how to get to the gender policy, if you use the toolbar at the top, you're going under projects and programs, and then you'll get to gender. And the gender policy has recently been translated by the GCF into French and Spanish as well. So everyone who's able to participate in this webinar, you should be able to read the gender policy in the language that best suits you. I wanted to share it because there's this assumption often, and it's a little bit wrong, that because the GCF has this commitment to gender and because it has a gender policy, that it is doing everything it can on gender. And when you actually read this gender policy, you will see that it does not have the depth or robustness of commitment that we would really hope to see. And unfortunately, as we were advocating for a stronger gender policy, some of our points in the GCF Observer Network were not taken up. But you can read it for yourself. So rather than just assuming the existence of a gender policy, is a good sign, which it is, you can understand really what it does call for, which is some specific activities and obligations of the GCF Secretariat and the accredited entities as they are implementing their work. So I did want to highlight just a few excerpts from the objectives of the gender policy, because I do think that these aspirational statements are a really good anchoring point for our future advocacy. So committing the GCF to enhancing gender equality within its structure and its operations, and promoting gender equality through all of its decisions and through its allocations of funds. And the gender action plan that is referred to here is the gender action plan that accompanies the gender policy, that has specific responsibilities primarily for the Secretariat to carry out. This is separate from the gender action plans that are each submitted with all that specific project or program will be implementing gender elements of its project. So I also wanted to note the way in which this gender policy attempts to move beyond a narrow understanding of gender, but this language obviously did not go as far as some of us would have hoped it would, but really just fundamentally recognizing that when we're talking about gender, we're talking about a tool for analysis and a lens. We're not just using that as a code word for women. One of the other pieces of guidance that we have, and a key document within the suite of materials that the GCF has provided, is this mainstreaming gender toolkit, which is based on a one-day workshop with UN Women, packaged it in this publication. But it's important because it looks at readiness, as well as the gender analysis and assessment process that's going into the individual project and program level. It looks at the results framework and ways in which it can be gender responsive, and then provides for monitoring. And so we're seeing the ways in which gender has been mapped out, that it could be fully operationalized in all of these aspects. And there is guidance given to accredited entities and NDAs, national designated authorities, that are doing this work. But I think this guidance hasn't necessarily been fully taken up by all of the actors that we see working within the GCF, which is why it's important to have spaces such as GCF Watch and the active participation of observers to follow up on these possibilities and make sure they become realities. The other piece of documentation that I want to highlight that the GCF provides to guide projects and programs is a template specifically on conducting the gender assessment, which is required now of every single project or program that is submitted to the GCF. It contains a bunch of guiding questions, and here's just a sample of them that really gets at what are the true gender dynamics within the area in which the project will be implemented. There's also a template for a gender action plan, and we have seen the ways in which this template has been widely used by the accredited entities submitting funding proposals as the way in which they want to present the activities that they will be undertaking as part of their project. And this template lays out activities with indicators and targets. It suggests a timeline for each activity, that you should outline who's responsible, and that you should outline the costs. Now, even though we've had wide uptake of this template, that doesn't necessarily mean that each of these elements is robustly dealt with by the individual accredited entities, and we still see a wide variation in quality among gender action plans, though I think on the whole, there have been some improvements over the past few years. So with those documents that are all available on the GCF website, you can start to get a better grasp of how the GCF handles gender. But I want to take it more broadly to really look at the importance of understanding fundamentally that feminist and women's rights voices should be integral to the development of any climate finance projects. And being a gender responsive fund or gender transformative fund would really mean that the GCF is shifting paradigms in the ways that climate action is being approached, that false solutions are being called out and not pursued, that there's a true response to the needs of an entire community, including women and girls in their full diversity, and a recognition of the marginalization of certain groups and identities, while ultimately being guided by the voices and experiences of women, grassroots, local communities, leaders, and Indigenous peoples. And this is the type of GCF we want to see. And that means that there are GCF issue areas that have incredibly strong overlap with gender, some of which Liane just introduced. This includes, of course, information disclosure and the ability to understand what projects and programs are being planned for your area in order to center the voices and experiences from the get-go, from the design and conceptualization of a project, as well as to be able to follow the implementation of it. And then some of these issue areas are ones that Liane highlighted as coming up and being postponed for conversations later this year. And each of these has ways in which they intersect with gender. But I would actually say, frankly, that all of the GCF issue areas have an incredible overlap with gender in the ways in which we understand how adaptation should be gender responsive, in the ways in which we are supporting full cost methodology as being critical to actually providing climate finance that could be considered feminist, and ensuring that every project is held to the highest standards and has the infrastructure in place in order to truly implement the types of commitments and advances that we want to see with regard to gender equality. And that's a key part of our conversation around an assessment approach that would be project specific rather than the traditional accreditation approach. So I hope you will leave with that message as we continue learning about other issue areas, obviously Indigenous peoples and REDD+, where there will continue to be incredible intersections with gender. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tara. Thank you also for them to share these wonderful presentations with our colleagues so that they can also access those publications. Continue putting your questions in the chat, and Florencia and I will manage that at the end. And I'm allowing the presenters to present to the very end, and then we'll turn into questions and comments. Now I'm going to the third presenter, Helen Biangalen Magata, and I hope again I'm pronouncing it well. Welcome, Helen, for your presentation.
Thank you, Salina. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm very thankful to AIDA for inviting us to be part of this webinar series. And also, like Tara, I'm very happy to be part of this panel of experts on the Green Climate Fund and on climate finance in general. So I'll be sharing with you one crucial important policy of the Green Climate Fund in terms of ensuring safeguards and human rights in its operations. This is also part of the steps of the GCF to be true to its governing instrument, to develop mechanisms and promote input of participation of stakeholders, including civil society organizations, women, and indigenous peoples in the design, development, and implementation of the strategies and activities to be financed by the fund. So, the GCF Indigenous Peoples Policy was adopted in the 19th board meeting in 2018, with the overall objective of ensuring that GCF activities are developed and implemented in a manner that respects Indigenous peoples' rights, and that Indigenous peoples benefit from the GCF activities and projects in a culturally appropriate manner, and that they do not suffer harm or adverse effects from the design and implementation of all GCF finance activities. So the policy aims to support and promote the welfare, the positive contributions of Indigenous peoples, for them to be actively participating in all project design and implementation, and the determination of project arrangements with particular attention to challenges by Indigenous women, girls, and other groups. So the policy also aims to promote and respect Indigenous peoples' rights to own, use, develop, and control their lands, territories, and resources that they possess. The objective of the Indigenous Peoples Policy is also to recognize and respect and preserve the culture, knowledge, and practices of Indigenous peoples, and to foster full respect and promotion of economic resource management systems and practices, and to apply the principle of free, prior, and informed consent, and to ensure that all grievance mechanisms are accessible, that they are fair, they are transparent, and culturally appropriate. It also aims to recognize and operationalize Indigenous peoples' equitable access to the benefits of all GCF funded activities, using the ILO 169 and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as basis and as framework. So what is the scope of application of the Indigenous Peoples Policy? So the Indigenous Peoples Policy will apply to all Indigenous peoples as characterized in varying degrees. So for example, including self-identification and recognition of this identity by others, collective attachment to geographically distinct habitats, distinct language, or customary cultural, economic, and social or political institutions that are separate and distinct from those of the mainstream society. So at a minimum, this policy will apply to Indigenous peoples as characterized in Article 1 of ILO 169. Like the gender policy, the IP policy also applies to all GCF finance projects and activities by both public and private sectors, or wherever Indigenous peoples are present or have collective attachment to areas where GCF finance activities will be implemented. So this is regardless whether Indigenous peoples will be affected positively or negatively, and regardless of the presence or absence of legal recognition of Indigenous peoples in their countries. The policy will also be applied regardless of how Indigenous peoples are referred to or called in their countries. So even if you're called ethnic minority, or Juma, for example, in Bangladesh, or sub-Saharan African historically underserved traditional local communities, it doesn't matter. So this policy applies anyway. I'm going to walk you through some of the guiding principles of the GCF Indigenous Peoples Policy. So the policy provides that there's a need to develop and implement free, prior, informed consent for all projects that affect Indigenous peoples, including their lands, territories, livelihoods, and cultures. And there's a need to respect and enhance the right of Indigenous peoples to their lands, territories, and resources. In the policy, free, prior, and informed consent is described as an iterative process. It should not only be done in the concept stage or funding proposal stage, but in the different cycle of operations of projects and programs. This is also requiring consent before any GCF activity is undertaken. And this is on the basis of Indigenous peoples' independent deliberation and collective decision-making processes. So the end result of an FPIC could include a negative or an answer which is or a no answer, and this should be equally respected and recognized as FPIC. So there's the IU policy also states that there's a need to recognize and implement relevant international human standards using, I have already mentioned this, ILO 169, the third, the UN REDD. And it also respects the rights of Indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation. So accredited entities will take all appropriate measures to recognize, respect, and protect rights of Indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation, and that the aspects of the GCF funded activities that would result in such undesired contact will not be processed further. The enhanced respect and recognition of traditional knowledge and livelihood systems, the enhancement of the capacity of Indigenous peoples issues within the GCF. So the policy provides that the GCF shall develop its advisory and decision-making capacities to understand and properly address Indigenous peoples and rights. That also it will facilitate direct access to GCF resources for Indigenous peoples and respect the systems of self-government of Indigenous peoples. And this is what many states are not very happy about, because it provides that the GCF should promote respect for the rights of Indigenous peoples to freely pursue their economic and social cultural development and the right to autonomy or self-government in matters relating to their internal and local affairs. So what are the roles and responsibilities of the GCF and accredited entities towards implementation of the policy? So the GCF accredited entities need to involve and take into account interests of Indigenous peoples Representatives and bodies, including community members and Indigenous women and youth, in conducting meaningful consultations that are tailored to Indigenous peoples. So in practical terms, this would mean that consultations for GCF projects and programs should be done at the regional or national levels, and that the process will provide sufficient time for Indigenous peoples' decision-making processes. That Indigenous peoples and accredited entities also should agree on appropriate engagement and consultation processes as early as possible, commensurate with the scale or impact of the GCF project. And lastly, that accredited entities will facilitate the development of an Indigenous peoples plan or framework in partnership with Indigenous peoples whenever designing a GCF proposal. And this is one of the challenges that we see in looking at funding proposals that come to the Green Climate Fund. Funding proposals do not look alike when they are submitted to the board. Some do have their Indigenous peoples planning framework. Some do not even have any information about which Indigenous communities the projects or sub-projects will be affecting or will be implementing. So the grievance and redress mechanism will take into account the institutions, rules, and customs of Indigenous peoples and their level of interaction with the mainstream society, and that compensations, so all adverse impacts should be avoided to maximum extent possible. However, where alternatives have been systematically explored to consider feasible alternative projects or project design to avoid adverse impacts, and if adverse impacts are unavoidable, then the accredited entity will minimize and compensate for these impacts in a culturally appropriate manner. and that this will take into account the nature and context of the GCF finance activities and the context of Indigenous peoples' vulnerability. So the grievance mechanism will be designed in consultation with affected or potentially affected Indigenous communities, and that it should be prompt, it should be accessible, it should be fair, transparent, and constructive. It should also be appropriate culturally, and that it does not impede the access to judicial or administrative remedies that may be available through other systems, including, for example, from the accredited entity at the project level or from the country systems. It should also consider customary laws in Indigenous communities, including dispute resolution mechanisms and justice systems that are existing in Indigenous areas. It includes appeals to processes to which are unsatisfied, or to grievances which are unsatisfied, and should provide mediation as an option where users are not satisfied with the proposed resolution. So in terms of, and this is going to be my last slide, implementation arrangements. So the board is going to oversee and review the implementation of this policy. Every 5 years, they're going to do a review, and that the board is going to also monitor, and the secretariat is going to report on how this is being implemented to the board. So the secretariat and the accredited entities will undertake periodic assessments of the implementation, and that it says that a senior Indigenous people specialist will be appointed. The GCF has already hired an Indigenous people's focal point with the operational responsibility to manage and implement this policy. And we hope that 3 years after the adoption of the Indigenous people's policy, that we hope by end of 2021 that the Indigenous Peoples Advisory Group is going to be constituted. So there are challenges in terms of operationalizing and also the implementation of the Indigenous Peoples policy, for including, for example, the capacities of accredited entities to implement this in the funding in the project level, and also the capacities of the GCF itself, and at the institutional level, including the abilities and capacities. For example, and this is related to the role of the Indigenous independent technical assessment panel, for example, in terms of looking at funding proposals and how these funding proposals are really honestly reflecting and implementing the policy in terms of looking at how Indigenous peoples are potentially affected. So yeah, and one of the other challenge is that, of course, the language which is English is obviously a challenge, not just for Indigenous peoples, but for other regions as well. And all of these challenges are being magnified, amplified in the context of the ongoing pandemic. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Helen, for that presentation. I just want to remind people to continue putting their questions on the chat, and those will be answered at the very end of the presentations. I'm now going to call upon our last speaker of the day, who is Mr. Souparna Lahiri. Welcome, please, and make your remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Salina, and thanks for providing this opportunity to speak in the webinar. Welcome and hello to all. I'll be brief and to the point. Ever since the REDD plus RBP proposal has been approved by the GCF board, our response to the proposals has been largely limited within the contours of the GCF policies and the RBP framework. We have discussed and debated on good and bad projects, gone into technical details like the FREL, baseline, leakage, permanence, and safeguards. Incidentally, this Cancun safeguards is like an appendix or annex and an afterthought. And so are the most important issues and actions related to IPLCs, such as tenure and land rights, governance, gender, FPIC, and livelihood and food security. What could essentially be cramped under the jargon of non-carbon benefits, but these are mostly ignored as we see in the RBP proposals. So far, within the CSOs monitoring the GCF, we have an extensive discourse on lack of equity, regional imbalance, price of carbon, market versus non-market, stringent or less stringent mechanism, methodological requirements, carbon rights, reversals, using carbon credits in indices, conditional or unconditional, and or determining which are the non-carbon benefits and non-carbon elements. But so far, we have not been able to do justice to the voices and concerns raised by the national and local level NGOs, especially in the case of Brazil and Paraguayan proposals, and also perhaps the Indonesian one, resulting in the notion that every proposal raised in the GCF would be ultimately approved, and therefore there is little incentive for the communities and local NGOs to engage in these international mechanisms, leading to serious exclusion of ground level concerns and voices from the communities. The mandate of GCF, however, is to finance transformative climate action. So how far the REDD plus RBP program satisfies these criterions? Since REDD plus is all about stopping deforestation and land degradation, the mechanism is supposed to ensure conservation and protection of forests, something the colonial and state-supported highly centralized conservation policies have failed to ensure so far. These policies need to be transformed, and what we are looking for is a decentralized, community-governed, rights-based, socially just, and gender-responsive forest conservation policy, dismantling the colonial and centralized one. The question, therefore, is whether does the REDD Plus, in its concept, process, and methodology of implementation and outcomes, support this transformation? Or we have landed up with a mechanism that is driven by the same state which inherited colonial, centralized, and exclusionary forest conservation policy in association with institutional and financial intermediaries implementing a techno-financial approach, as opposed to an inclusive right-based approach that is transformative in nature and leads to just conservation practices and real climate solutions. The fate of the safeguard information system and the complete lack of safeguards such as tenure rights, community governance, FPIC, gender, that should have been in place and implemented during the period for which emission reductions are claimed, point to this exclusion, a barrier to transformative action. In that context, REDD plus RBP has so far failed as a transformative climate action. The GCF CSOs have so far been able to manage a limited intervention strategy. We also hear that the GCF has to work under the UNFCCC mandate, COP decisions and rules, though the Paris Agreement talks of transformation and rights of IPLCs and women. Our ultimate objective is to fight for and support transformative climate actions. Our objective should be to uphold the right-based approach as a cornerstone to avoid deforestation and degradation, the rights of the IPLCs and women, which are not relegated to an annex of a global agreement, but recognized and integrated into the global consensus for climate justice and conservation and protection of forests, leading to real climate solutions and not techno-finance driven false solutions. Both the GCF and the REDD plus RBP has so far failed to uphold the rights of the forest communities, and therefore the consequent policy action to halt deforestation and forest degradation is bound to fail. The CSOs in GCF have to be much more proactive to support the rights-based approach and bring the right-based approach within the corridors of GCF. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that presentation. Right to the point. So we will now, would like to again thank all the presenters. We are now going to proceed to take questions that people have put them in the chat for the different panelists, and I ask the panelists also to respond. Even if the question is for someone else, you can always respond to a question that has been asked if you have something else to add. So I'll start the question to Liane. The first question to Liane is, given that Sumitomo Mitsui Banking Corporation has been the subject of a fierce petition from international civil society against its accreditation, why has SMBC been accredited by the FVC anyways? And the second question is to you, Liane, again, how does the GCF support civil society organizations and communities in following up on approved projects? Is there any tools to ensure premises are fulfilled? So maybe you can answer that, then I'll move to Tara.
Great, thank you very much, Salina, and thank you also for the great questions. First one on Sumitomo Mitsui Banking Corporation, Hervé, I think this was your question. And this is indeed the question, why, if it's very clear that this is a commercial bank, a Japanese commercial bank, who has made a lot of money in the past and is continuing to make money from funding fossil fuel projects, which is actually counter to the mission of the GCF. Why have they been accredited to the GCF? There are several answers to that, unfortunately. One of the primary one is that there is a key interest within the GCF to have commercial banks accredited to the Green Climate Fund. So commercial banks that can act as financial intermediaries in, for example, reaching out and pursuing private sector projects. So this discussion has not been new. We had the same challenges with a number of other banks. The short response has always been, you need to bring them into the fold of the Green Climate Fund so that they can actually shift their portfolio so that they can be better. In the case of SMBC, one of the justifications that was brought forward was the fact that between basically the last board meeting in March and this board meeting, SMBC has come out with a new updated policy, including on basically a new updated climate policy that is more explicit in indicating that it would not fund coal-fired power plants going forward. However, our colleagues that have looked at it and analyzed that find that there are quite a number of loopholes, because it's, for example, not quite clear what that means of providing financial services for other actors that might still be supporting coal-fired power plants. And obviously, with a number of their other holdings, they are not moving out of fossil fuel more broadly. So this is the reason why we have rejected it. For most of the board members, including a couple of developed country board members that at the last board meetings have brought up a number of objections, this was apparently enough of a justification or enough of a fig leaf to say, yes, the SMBC has showcased, has really proven that they are willing to shift the way that they are doing business. And again, that's the argumentation. This is why you want to bring them into the fold of the Green Climate Fund community so that they would indicate also that they would shift their patterns of action. On the second question, this is a little bit more complicated in the sense that unfortunately there is no one supportive tool that would come from the GCF or the Secretariat, where you would say, you give an explicit role to civil society organizations and communities in providing that on-the-ground monitoring, for example, by supporting them financially to do that. This is what should be happening. Unfortunately, this is not what is happening. The governing instrument, which is the constitution of the Green Climate Fund, has a provision in there that says that the GCF should support participatory monitoring, which is exactly the role that civil society organizations and communities on the ground in looking at what is happening and whether an implementation is on the right track should provide. Unfortunately, in the GCF at the moment, this is very insufficiently interpreted. We are pushing for a revision of the observer participation guidelines more broadly that would take that part into account as well, but it's a work in progress. At the moment, quote unquote, the only formal recourse is as part of the stakeholder consultation and engagement obligations of the accredited entity, which is supposed to be an ongoing process. So most of them have to submit, although we don't always see them, stakeholder engagement plans, and they should spell out what role, for example, local communities and civil society organizations on the ground have. But again, unfortunately, this is very, very inconsistently approached and usually doesn't come with any financial provision for groups on the ground to take on that role. I stop here. Thanks.
Thank you very much for those very clear and elaborate answers. Let me now move on to Tara. And Tara, there are two questions here. How enforceable are gender plans? Can communities or civil society make a complaint to GCF if they are not complied with? Could there be sanctions to accredited entities that don't comply with them? And secondly, during B29, the FB 1967 project was criticized by civil society because the document on the consideration of the GCF gender approach in the project was disclosed late. In this case, what means does the GCF have to ensure that the AE carrying out this project will respect the gender approach of the GCF during the implementation of the project? Interesting questions.
Thank you so much for these two questions, which I think ultimately have to do with the same issue, which is accountability. How do we hold the accredited entities accountable for the commitments that they are making towards gender equality when they are submitting their project and program funding proposals? So first, one of the issues that was raised in the question in the Q&A was that FP 167 had been submitted with a very extensive gender assessment, that as folks were reviewing the hundreds of pages of that funding proposal prior to the board meeting, they realized that it wasn't followed by an actual gender action plan outlining specific activities and how they would be fulfilled, and being informed by that assessment and that understanding of gender to actually translate into a work plan on gender as part of this project or program. Now, that was disclosed prior to the project being approved, which means it is on record. And I do think at this point, the question merges with the other question around enforceability. So we have a little insight into how gender action plans are being enacted, and that's only at this point through the annual performance reports that accredited entities themselves submit. And we've not had access to all of them. Many of the private sector ones have not been disclosed, and the most recent batch has still not been disclosed for the most recent year of implementation, 2020. So we primarily have access to 2019 APRs. So we don't have a lot of insight into what's happening, which is where I would point you to everything Liane was just talking about the importance of ensuring that we have resources and can really follow up on how participatory monitoring and the knowledge of what's happening on the ground can inform our understanding. Now, if that knowledge points to should see, that we are not seeing the activities we should see, the GCF has an independent redress mechanism, the IRM, and a complaint can be submitted to it. And we would welcome anyone that feels that they are living in a project area where their project is not fulfilling its obligations to the community to submit a complaint to the IRM, which will go through an extensive and robust process in order to try and investigate the issue and find appropriate remedy. So we're looking forward to the ways in which the IRM can ensure enforceability in future, as well as highlight issues so that future projects and the continued implementation of projects are taking into account the way that things should be done as they continue their project implementation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for those responses. The next question now goes to Helen. Helen, does the GCF promote in any way that Indigenous peoples participate in the design of projects, and more than participation, that they are the ones to propose the projects they feel they need? So this is a very good question, and really it touches also my remarks earlier on when I opened up the conversation by saying Indigenous people really do not have any rights to own anything or even make decisions. So please, can you answer the question? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and I agree, this is indeed a very good question and a difficult one, I must say. So, well, I can give examples of how I think Indigenous people's participation is being promoted or not in the Green Climate Fund as it is now. So unlike in the UNFCCC, where Indigenous peoples are recognized as a distinct constituency, the architecture of the Green Climate Fund is different. So there is a network of CSOs, local communities, and Indigenous peoples acting as observers to the Green Climate Fund. And under this umbrella, or under this network, we have two active observers, one from the developed countries and one from the developing countries, who are sitting in the boardroom. And while this arrangement has so far been very helpful and also very supportive for in raising Indigenous people's concerns in the Green Climate Fund, the operationalization and the constitution of the Indigenous Peoples Advisory Group as contained in the Indigenous Peoples policy is yet to happen 3 years since the adoption of the IP policy. So the Indigenous Peoples Advisory Group is supposed to provide advice to the GCF Secretariat on Indigenous Peoples matter or to the board as necessary. So second, there is no allocated direct access, or there's no allocated funds for Indigenous peoples or to any CSOs and other local communities for that matter. So Indigenous peoples, anybody can bring concept notes or climate action ideas to accredited entities, but they have to go through the usual process of the Green Climate Fund. So the accredited and only accredited entities can bring funding proposals to the Green Climate Fund. Indigenous peoples can proactively reach out to NDAs to participate, for example, in country programs or national adaptation plans. But they are not, but because the Green Climate Fund is very strong in terms of pushing the principle of country ownership, it's up to the countries to do this. In terms of accountability, accredited entities are expected to adhere to the policy and develop their internal policies, procedures, and also their competencies to implement this policy. However, as I have said a while ago, funding assessments are unequal. So some, as Tara said, will come with a very comprehensive, for example, report on how they engage with indigenous peoples. Some will come with a skeleton of an IP planning framework, which, for example, outlines agreements of accredited entities and indigenous peoples on how to conduct engagement for the development of funding proposals, while some others simply say that they're going to adhere to the indigenous peoples policy, one-liner. So these are the challenges that indigenous peoples have. So even if we have a robust indigenous peoples policy on paper, so in terms of country ownership, for example, so country ownership form part of the relevant environmental and social safeguard standards, and that accredited entities and countries need to consider when developing proposals and implementing projects. Which means that at the country level, there should be a process where all stakeholders, including indigenous peoples and women and local communities, will be engaged in these processes. But unfortunately, you do not see this in the reports of accredited entities in their annual performance reports, for example, portfolio annual performance reports of funding proposals, and also in the readiness reports of countries. So there are examples that I know of personally of how indigenous peoples have been reaching out to their NDAs and also to accredited entities in their countries. But these are all their initiatives. It's the indigenous peoples being proactive and not really the GCF promoting per se, or with the support of the GCF. So I would say, and my colleagues can maybe also add in if my summary is wrong. So yeah, we have a very robust indigenous peoples policy on paper, but I think the GCF has to do more in terms of really making sure that this becomes a reality. Over.
Thank you very much. And that last remark where you are, the policies really exist, where you are saying that the GCF has to make it into a reality. I think that is the call, and that is the message that needs to go across. I'm going to ask this, I have one more question for Lahiri, and then I'll ask one general question for all the panelists. So bear with me. We may need another 3 minutes to be able to do that. And I'm asking this question to Lahiri because he spoke a lot around it. So the question says, faced with the need for transformative actions that put life at the center of our existence, to what extent does the participation of the global socio-environmental movement legitimize corporate captured processes and false solutions? For instance, nature-based solutions, REDD+, net zero, etc. How can we think ourselves once and for all outside the capitalist, patriarchal, racist, and colonial system that impacts our territories and our bodies on a daily basis?
Yes, thanks, Joanna. In parts, I completely agree with what you said. There are two points and two issues that we can think of as a strategy, and this has been followed by a lot of social movement, climate justice movement, the movement of the indigenous people and the forest communities, is to oppose the financialization and commodification of forests and other natural resources. And REDD+ is an attempt to the same financialization and commodification. And you clearly distinguish in even the REDD+ RBP that GCF has between the forest, the conservation and protection of forest and carbon. And so here carbon is also becoming a commodity. And so the financialization and commodification together acts to facilitate, the footprint of what you say, capitalism and corporate takeover of climate solutions. And we need to strategically fight against them. And as for the second part of your the issues that you have raised. I think the climate justice movement has to be really broad-based, and it has to recognize and give centrality to the right-based approach, to the indigenous people, local communities, and a gender transformative approach to the climate justice movement. And that is how we can we can mobilize a large section of this population, as you say, to smash patriarchy, to work against colonialism, to work against color, and have a just climate justice movement to 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 seek, fight, and struggle for real solutions and basically community-driven and governed solutions to the climate crisis today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Those some questions have been answered directly in the chat. For those questions that have been asked, if there are many more, we will answer them beyond this webinar. We've gone overboard 6 minutes past the time we were allowed to carry out this process. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank you all for your patience. We've gone through this together, and also to thank the 4 speakers. You are wonderful, excellent presentations, excellent answers to excellent questions. We will share the PowerPoint presentations for those of you who presented them with the participants. And I would now like to turn the conversation over to my colleague, Berta.
Thanks, Salina. I mean, I don't have anything to add. I think you've done an excellent job, and I would just like to thank everyone who has participated in this organization, and leave the floor to Florencia to just have the official closing of the meeting.
Hello, thank you very much, everyone who participated, even for a few extra minutes. I'd just like to thank you all and to invite you to the next webinar, which is at the end of this month. You'll obviously get the invitation as always. For that webinar, we'll be talking more about the role of regional nodes, so the ways that you can connect within your regions, within your countries. So there's a lot to learn there. So thank you very much. Bye-bye. Have a great day, afternoon, or night, depending on where you are.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.